Hey there and welcome back to another Rings of Power video. And today we'll be talking about the latest episode to drop, episode 4, The Great Wave, which follows up on a bunch of the different cliffhanger endings from the previous episode, but most importantly, shows us the identity of our first major villain of the series so far. And honestly, I've been enjoying the show, but I feel like this episode for me was a little bit disappointing. It very much felt like a whole lot of nothing ended up happening. It was a fair bit of setup and filler. And I don't think it was bad per se, but it definitely wasn't what I'd been hoping for. But anyway, with all that being said, let's jump into the episode. So we start off the episode in Numenor, where we have a little bit of a filler scene where the Queen Regent talks to a bunch of new mothers to give their blessings to their babies. Until this filler scene sort of transitions into the flooding of Numenor, with the city being completely wiped out and the Queen killed as the palace is submerged, until she wakes up in her room again. And it turns out all of this was just a dream. And yeah, that first part of the scene, it definitely had me worried that I was going to have to sit through a 5-minute slogfest of listening to Numenorian baby customs, so thankfully that wasn't the case here, and the scene got interesting very quickly. But putting that aside for a second, I do think this is a problem that the show has in general. Some scenes do go too long with not much interesting happening, and they do grow quite stale quite quickly. I don't mind exposition, but sometimes they need to know when to dial back. But anyway, she wakes up and she's a bit shaken up, and thus she wants to deal with Galadriel ASAP. Meanwhile, we get a little bit of a look at the discontent within the city, as the guild member that Halbrand battered alongside his friends last episode is stirring up anti-elf sentiment, and suggesting that perhaps the Queen is an elf sympathizer after all, just like her father is. And whilst this is all going on, we get a look at the man who's likely going to be capitalizing on all this unrest to increase his own power, as he's already schmoozing with the common men and getting in amongst it, whilst the Queen Regent sits above them all, attending to more imperial matters. And it is quite smart what this guy's doing. Anyway, his son approaches him, and after briefly getting scolded for not being wise enough to understand what's going on here, he informs his father of the unrest, of the people getting whipped up into an anti-elf frenzy, fearing an invasion or immortal elf workers coming in to steal their jobs. And I actually enjoyed the racism. That sounds weird. I like that it felt accurate, in that they cherry-pick these ideas, or just make shit up. They take the idea of elven immortality, which is a proven elvish fact, and they turn that into never sleeping, never tiring, never doing anything but work. And thus they can steal your jobs, as they don't rest, and they can be more productive. Anyway, the Chancellor turns up and he easily takes control of the crowd and reassures them they have nothing to fear from Galadriel, and that she's under control, and they can trust in him, not the Queen, in him. And Eärien, Isildur's daughter, watches all of this, and seems kind of troubled. So I'm kind of wondering if they're going to have her get swept up by the propaganda eventually. Or is she going to pretty much just align with her father and brothers? I think time's going to tell, but I think it would be interesting to have a conflict within the family on this issue, especially if she gets close to the Chancellor's son. Meanwhile, we get a look at the Queen meeting with Galadriel, and she isn't very happy that she snuck out of her confinement and went off to steal ancient scrolls from their Hall of Lore. Oh, and that Halbrand also battered some random citizens when he lost his temper. But Galadriel brushes all of that off and tells her that Halbrand has a right to be angry. After all, his people are dying, which I think that's a pretty generous reading of this situation. It doesn't really feel like he cares all that much about his people if we're being perfectly honest. She then goes on to tell the Queen that she believes that he is the lost heir to the Southlands, and that with the aid of Numenor, he'll be able to unite his scattered people to fight alongside them and the elves against Sauron. Of course, the Queen ain't buying any of this, and she tells her that their audience is at an end, which leads to Galadriel demanding an audience with the King and threatening the Queen, which lands her in jail with Halbrand for sedition. Whoops. Anyway, we then get a look at Isildur trying to join the Sea Guard, and once again, hearing the call and thus believing this is the sign he needs, he purposefully sabotages his training, getting kicked out alongside his entourage, which was not part of the plan. And yeah, whilst the dig about his dead mum was really not called for, he did just ruin that dude's entire life, so I do get it. But honestly, I don't really care about those guys anyway, or this storyline in general much yet, so don't really care. I was much more hyped for the Adar reveal, and I was curious to see what they were going to do with him. Were they going to tell us who this guy was going to be? Are they going to do a big reveal? And as of right now, no, they don't do that this episode, which is a little bit annoying. I mean, I do get it, but I felt like there was so much build up for this character in the previous episode, and then he just doesn't do anything, which was kind of lame. Anyway, the famously angry and self-serving orcs become docile and enraptured at the sight of Adar, pretty much treating him like a god, like a father. Which was a pretty interesting development, all things considered, and interestingly, he also seems to value them too, As he approaches one who's clearly dying of wounds, he comforts him, he smiles at him, and then he mercy kills him whilst looking on the verge of tears. Now, there are a lot of theories as to who this guy is, but I would say it's probably not Sauron, as I just don't see him being affectionate with orcs fitting in with his character very much. But anyway, he asks about Erondir, where he comes from, where he was born, and then he gives him a pretty generic evil dude speech talking about the great lies that he's been told, etc, etc. You know, those speeches are a dime a dozen. And all in all, it was a pretty bland first scene for this character, apart from his connection to the orcs, and them viewing him as some sort of father figure. But anyway, he spares Erondir, and he tells him to go to the men who are hiding in the old watchtower and deliver a message. And I'm just going to guess that the message is going to be along the lines of join me or die. And speaking of the men at the watchtower, they're getting people coming in from all over the Southlands, from as far away as Arodruin, which is also called Mount Doom. But the only problem with this influx of people is that for some reason, they didn't pack enough food, and they only have like 5 potatoes somehow. I mean shit, didn't they have until first light to pack up? It's not like these people could possibly have that many possessions worth taking with them. So I would assume that their livelihoods, their livestock and their food is what they would take with them. But somehow Waldrick just decided to leave all his food untouched in his cellar. And so Theo has the idea that they need to go into town and take what they can whilst it's still light out so the orcs can't attack them. But Bronwyn rejects the idea and tells him that he has to stay put and do as he's told, and then just leaves him alone unsupervised, which means he's immediately going to leave with his buddy to head back to the village to loot, which they do, and they stock up on a shit ton of goods. But of course, Theo can't resist. He gets greedy, and he wants just a little bit more. And so, cue the clouds starting to darken, and his friend taking the loot and booking it back to the tower, and Theo being left alone in the creepy village, almost certainly about to be ambushed by orcs, and look, the orc has snuck up behind him ready to cave in his skull. Oopsie. Anyway, they battle and Theo's leg gets messed up, but he manages to somehow escape because he pulls out his magic sword thing, which surprises the orc long enough for him to run away and hide down the well. And somehow, he doesn't get heard jumping into the well. You'd think he'd make an audible splash. And even when the orc does cotton on somehow, he neither hears the kid go under the water, nor does he hear him loudly emerge from the water, even though he's still within earshot. Meanwhile, we see that the dwarves have started assembling the forge for Celebrimbor, and that in, well, surely it's only been a matter of days, they've managed to construct a decent chunk of it. And then we get a bit of, honestly, it was quite forced exposition between Elrond and Celebrimbor, talking about how Elrond's father apparently prophesied that Elrond would help Celebrimbor in the future. I have no idea if that's from the source material or not, but either way, it felt clunky and forced. Celebrimbor then mentions to Elrond that it seems like Prince Durin's hiding something from him, and that he's been avoiding Celebrimbor like the plague. And so Elrond heads back to Khazad-dûm to talk to Disa to ask after Durin. But she keeps avoiding the question, and then starts to clearly lie to him. So Elrond has to use his elven advantages to listen in on one of their conversations to find out what Durin's been hiding in the old mine beneath the Mirrormere. And thus, he makes his way there, gets yelled at a little by Durin, but still manages to convince him that he's only there as his friend, and he won't be stealing dwarven secrets for the elves. And thus, after swearing an oath on the memory of his father, Elrond convinces Durin to show him the secret, which is just Mithril. And yeah, okay, a decent chunk of the episode was dedicated to this. I think I want to go back to the orcs if I'm being honest. But not yet. But at least their friendship's getting back to what it once was, I guess. And then the tunnel collapses and Durin rushes in to try and help his lads, and we abruptly transition to Numenor, just to set you on edge and make you nervous for Durin. I mean, not that they would kill him off, but still, I get what they were doing there. But anyway, back to Numenor, we see Aarion get a date with the son of the Chancellor, which further cements my belief that she's going to be against her family at some point, at least at first. And then it's over to the prison that Halbrand and Galadriel are being held in, where Halbrand basically tells Galadriel she needs to pull her head in and start thinking like a politician, not a general. And that she needs to start thinking about what the Númenóreans actually want and what they fear, and how therefore she can master them using that knowledge. And of course this gives her the plan to try and break into the king's tower to speak to him, and thus when the Chancellor and his guards come to take her back to the elves, she beats them up and locks them in her cell to give her the best possible chance to succeed. And I'm not sure how she thinks that beating down an important politician and his men is going to convince the Númenóreans to help her, especially since didn't this king get deposed in a civil war or a coup or something like that? He's a figurehead with no power. How could he possibly get her an army? And also, why does Pharazôn just let her leave? Like, doesn't that guy in lore beat Sauron 1v1? And he's nervous about fighting Galadriel? Not sure I buy that, but okay. We then have a scene with Isildur sulking about ruining his friends' lives, which, yeah, didn't add anything to the story, just a bit of padding to the episode. Before we cut to Galadriel, having scaled the tower and busted into the king's chambers, only to find that he's bedridden and incoherent, coughing, dying, all that good stuff. And Galadriel, for once, apologises for her rash actions, but asks the queen why she disdains elves so much if her father held them in such high regard. And from this scene, we learn that Miriel's father had always held elves in high esteem, but was more subdued in his beliefs. But after he was crowned, he began to become more and more extreme, which eventually resulted in unrest and then rebellion, all because he wanted to restore relations with the elves. So yeah, looks like Numenor has a big problem with xenophobia at this point in time. She then shows her a Palantir, the magic seeing stones, telling her the others are either lost or hidden. Although, I thought in lore they only all got lost after Isildur actually defeated Sauron. Aren't they lost over the decline of Arnor and Gondor, the two kingdoms that were formed after the fall of Numenor? So, shouldn't they still all be on Numenor at this point? Nah, oh well, doesn't really matter. She then gets Galadriel to use the Palantir to see the future of the kingdom, and thus we get another look at the sinking of the island, with Miriel telling her that the vision always begins with Galadriel's arrival to Numenor, and that therefore, she has to leave, as otherwise she thinks it's going to lead to Numenor's destruction. Although, I gotta say, I'm kind of with Galadriel on this one. The Valar gifted them the island for helping the elves defeat Morgoth. Surely the best way to stay in their good graces would be to help the elves defeat Sauron, instead of hoarding their strength and power, hiding away and abandoning the rest of the world. Queen's kind of delusional here, I honestly don't even understand her reasoning a little bit. She claims it's the will of the gods to send Galadriel away. But surely the gods would want Sauron defeated, right? Right? Ah, dummy. Back at the Watchtower, it turns out that Theo was right, and they really should have gotten food from the town because there's nothing here. Just a single bird and some vegetables. Either way, it's not enough to feed the entire camp even for one night. And it's at this point in time that Rowan arrives with his wheelbarrow full of food, but no Theo, which gets his mum to start panicking. Bet she wishes she'd gone with him now. I'm thinking she probably could have convinced him not to go into the tavern for extra when they'd already gotten so much, but oh well, you live and learn. But back in the village, for some reason, even though it's been hours and hours, the orcs still haven't left, and they still assume that Theo's in the town. But yeah, sure. Anyway, he climbs out of the well and he sneaks through the town in a scene that felt straight out of a video game. Also, why did he run through the town? Wouldn't it make more sense to double back and leave the town from another direction and then circle around to the tower? I mean, yeah, his leg's injured and it would take longer, but it's better than being brutally murdered by orcs. Of course, just as he's about to escape, the lead orc finds him from out of nowhere and is then promptly killed by Erondir, who helps Theo escape in slow motion through the forest. This is a pretty cool scene. Bronwyn arrives, the sun comes out, the orcs flee. Although, the music they were playing was very dramatic and kind of sad, so it felt like they were trying to tease somebody getting killed, but of course it wouldn't make sense for any of these three characters to die here, so it ended up feeling a bit odd. Although, the slow motion itself, I didn't actually mind it. Some people hate stuff like that, but when it's done well, I think it looks really good. And this was done well. Then we have a dwarven singing ceremony, and honestly, this whole scene, it was pretty epic. And it was made even more intense as at this stage, it wasn't really clear if Durin had survived. So whilst it was obvious if you thought about it that he would still be alive, you could also infer that this was potentially a memorial for him, which would have been even more sad as he and Elrond had only just finally patched up their friendship. And I really enjoyed the singing to the mountain. It was really eerie and beautiful. But yeah, turns out Prince Durin's not dead, and neither are any of the miners. But King Durin's now banned mining for Mithril, so there's that. And because of this ban, it means that Prince Durin is really not all that happy with him, which prompts Elrond to once again shoehorn in his own father to the story for the third time this episode. And he tells Durin that his dad was basically a Giga Chad, but he wishes he had more time with him. So therefore, Durin, you should go talk to your dad, because our situations are totally the same. But yeah, he is right that Durin probably is taking it all too hard. After all, the king just wants his people safe, and I'm pretty sure mining for Mithril does eventually wake up the Balrog that lives deep in the mountain and wipes out their city in a couple of thousand years, so whoops. But yeah, we also got some top tier banter from Elrond as he mocks Durin about their first meeting, where he saved a screaming Durin from a trio of trolls, thinking that they were attacking a child. Durin then goes to his father and they reconcile, and it's all a big misunderstanding of his father just wanting to keep their people safe, keep his son safe. Figured as much. And they then talk about how there's much more to what's going on in Lindon and with the elves as to what's been mentioned. more to Celebrimbor's creation that even Elrond would be aware of, and so Prince Durin needs to find out what that is. And I think this is of course going to lead into the design of the rings being revealed, and I think Sauron's probably already been making moves off screen and has been in contact with Celebrimbor already. We just don't know it yet. We then cut back to the Southlands Tower, where Arondir and Bronwyn have a pretty brief romantic moment, staring longingly, she rubs his arm, before he kills the mood by telling her that Adar has told them to surrender and join him, or die, and that he'll be coming for them soon, before the obviously evil tavern keeper proves himself to be obviously evil as he tries to get Theo to become a Sauron sympathizer, and tells him that his time is near, that the fallen star proves it. So basically, this feels like the show trying to imply that the stranger is Sauron, but honestly, that feels like a major misdirect. I think the writers would want it to be more of a twist than that, and outright telling us now, that's not really a twist. I don't think it's him. And meanwhile, Adar finds out that the hilt is in the tower, and so now, I think the Orcs are definitely just going to attack and won't even bother trying to earn their fealty at this point. And meanwhile, on Numenor, Galadriel's in the midst of being banished from the island and returned to Middle-earth, which, is obviously the wrong choice, but okay. I mean, shit, even the Great Tree of Numenor literally starts dying the moment she leaves, which apparently means that the Valar disagree with what's going on. It's a bit sad that they needed the tree to realise this, but okay. And so the Queen calls back Galadriel and gives a rousing speech and pledges to aid the Southlands in the war to come, whilst Elendil gathers up recruits for an expeditionary force, with Isildur and his friends joining up. And it seems that the tree did the trick, as suddenly everybody wants to go and help after years of wanting to be isolated and cut off from the world, which is where the episode ends. And yeah, this episode, I think I liked it at first, but the more I thought about it, the more filler it became. And look, I don't hate it, it was just a bit slow and plotting. And not much really happened at all, and I was also a bit let down by the whole Adar thing. They built him up for the entirety of last episode, only to hardly use him at all here. It was just a bit too much of a tease. So hopefully the next episode's a bit more meaty. But anyway, with all that being said, these are just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the episode? Like it, hate it? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know.